The night was falling quietly over Redfield Airport, a small terminal long since abandoned in the American Midwest. The runway lights were off, the wind gently rustling the bushes around, and everything seemed immersed in an endless silence. Until suddenly, the radar of a nearby military base picked up a signal. Something was approaching the runway. Something impossible. The operators were stunned when they confirmed the flight number, 404, a commercial airplane that had been missing for exactly 10 years. There were no signs of communication. No distress calls. Just the muffled sound of an engine cutting through the night sky, and the glint of its lights flashing in the distance. In less than 10 minutes, the plane landed, its wheels touching the worn asphalt with ease, as if it were just another routine night. However, this was the night no one would ever be able to explain. Inside the plane, the air was thick, heavy with an almost sepulchral silence. Each of the 180 passengers sat in their seats, completely bewildered. To them, no time had passed. A middle-aged man sitting by the window gripped the armrests tightly, his breathing uneven. A young woman beside him looked around, disoriented, as if trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. But no one spoke. No one knew what to say. Because for them, the flight had only taken off a few hours ago. And now, they were back, with no idea of where they had been. The commotion soon erupted when authorities arrived. Reporters, investigators, and government agents surrounded the plane, desperate for answers. Every passenger was carefully escorted to a containment area. The media quickly seized the story. How could a flight that had disappeared for a decade reappear without any warning? No radar signals? Was it a conspiracy? A natural phenomenon? Or something even more sinister? Among the experts called in to deal with the situation was Dr. Emma Clark, a renowned psychologist specializing in trauma and unexplained phenomena. At 38, Emma was known for her analytical calmness, always centered and composed in the face of chaos. When she received the call the next morning, she could barely believe what she was hearing. A plane that had been missing for 10 years had reappeared, and the passengers needed help understanding what had happened to them. It was the kind of case that defied logic, and Emma knew she was about to dive into something that could change her life forever. When she arrived at the base where the passengers were being held, the tension in the air was palpable. Armed guards stood at every hallway, and the atmosphere was thick with uncertainty. Emma was immediately taken to the control center, where the lead investigators were gathered. Her instructions were clear: interview the passengers, find out what they remembered, and try to piece together what could have happened during those lost 10 years. The first passenger Emma met was John Miller, a 47-year-old man with deep exhaustion etched into his face. He sat in a small interrogation room, his posture rigid, eyes fixed on the table in front of him. When Emma entered, he barely lifted his gaze. She knew she had to tread carefully. People who go through profound trauma often retreat into themselves, unable to process what had happened. "Do you remember anything?" Emma asked, her voice calm, trying to build a bridge of trust. Miller finally looked up at her, his eyes full of confusion and fear. He shook his head slowly, his breath heavy. "It was like we were stuck somewhere," he said finally. "There was no time. There was nothing. Just a presence. Something watching us." Miller's words sent a chill down Emma's spine. She hadn't expected to hear something so disturbing right off the bat. But she pressed on, asking more questions, trying to dig into what Miller might remember. Yet every answer led to the same place, a void. A space between time and nothingness. And always, the same ominous presence. A feeling of being watched by something they couldn't see. The following days brought more interrogations, and each passenger seemed to share a similar version of the story. None of them remembered specific events. Just flashes of a suspended existence, as if they had been trapped in a timeless limbo. And always, the same dark presence. A sense of being watched. Increasingly intrigued and unsettled, Emma began taking detailed notes. Despite the variations in their descriptions, one thing was certain: all the passengers recounted the same experience of lost time and the same invisible entity. Something that seemed to have come back with them, or worse, something that was still following them. The idea was disturbing. If they had all experienced the same thing, what could it mean? As the investigations continued, a strange pattern began to emerge. Some passengers started reporting intense nightmares, as if they were reliving those moments of emptiness. Others claimed to feel a presence near them, even in broad daylight. And then, the first disappearance happened. The disappearance of one of the passengers was the first major shock to the entire operation. Samuel Brooks, a 35-year-old accountant, had been found in a state of shock just hours before vanishing completely. The surveillance team had been monitoring everyone's movements, and the investigators were on high alert for any strange behavior. But no one could explain how Samuel simply disappeared. He had been in his room under constant supervision, but during the shift change, he was gone. There were no traces, no signs of struggle. Just an open window, a cold breeze blowing in, and an empty space where Samuel should have been. Emma was immediately called in to try and understand what might have happened. The pressure at the facility escalated. Additional guards were stationed, and fear began to spread among the other passengers. Nobody had any answers, and the feeling of being hunted started to haunt the atmosphere. Emma knew that Samuel's disappearance was a warning. Something more was happening to these passengers, something beyond psychological trauma. She began reviewing the earlier interviews, looking for any detail she might have missed. The stories, fragmented as they were, started to converge into a pattern, an invisible presence, like a shadow that never left them. Emma had dealt with many trauma cases before, but this was different. The accounts weren't just mental confusion, they were describing an almost tangible sense of being followed even now, after their return. During one of her subsequent interviews, Emma met Julie Harper, a 27-year-old passenger. Julie had been one of the quieter ones up to that point, keeping to herself, withdrawing from the others. When Emma pushed her to describe any memory, Julie hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. I see things," Julie whispered, her voice barely audible. "Sometimes when I'm alone, I can feel it's still there, watching. Even here. It's here, can't you see?" Emma tried to remain calm in the face of this revelation. The air in the room grew heavier, and she felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't the first time she had heard about this mysterious figure. The passengers all described it in different ways, but always with the same core detail: a shadow, a presence they couldn't see but knew was there. As the interviews progressed, the reports of nightmares intensified. Many passengers began to suffer from insomnia, claiming they couldn't sleep without feeling like they were being watched. The sessions with Emma became more frequent, and she could sense the growing fear, not only among the passengers but also among the guards and staff involved in the operation. The tension in the facility was palpable. No one knew what to expect next. Then, a series of strange events began to occur. Objects disappeared from the rooms where the passengers were held, only to reappear in odd places. Security cameras showed inexplicable interference, with parts of recordings becoming corrupted. One guard reported seeing a shadow moving down the hallway at night, but when he checked, no one was there. These phenomena made no sense, and the more Emma tried to find a logical explanation, the further from reason it all seemed. Dr. Clark began documenting each of these events in a journal, trying to draw a line between the occurrences and the passengers' reports. The pressure to find answers was mounting, but the more she investigated, the more she realized the answers weren't rooted in logic. Something out of the ordinary was happening, something that defied all scientific understanding she had. The situation reached a new level of tension when one of the passengers, Ethan Carter, suddenly collapsed during an interview. He awoke moments later, but his gaze was blank, and he began muttering something in an unknown language. The medical staff were called in, but nothing they did seemed to help. Ethan spoke in a strange cadence, as if in a trance. The nurses tried to restrain him, but he began thrashing, shouting incomprehensible words. Then Emma heard it. It was as though Ethan was calling out to something. Not someone, but something. The incident sent everyone into a heightened state of alert. It was no longer just a case of psychological trauma. There was something deeper, something that defied logical explanation. Emma decided to consult experts from various fields, including a linguist, in an attempt to decipher what Ethan was saying. The linguist arrived the next day, studying the recordings of Ethan's speech carefully. After hours of analysis, he finally turned to Emma, his face grim. What he's saying, it's in an ancient language. A language tied to forgotten cults. What he's speaking about involves portals. Crossing from one place to another. The revelation was a blow to Emma. Portals? It was something she'd never considered in any rational context. But with each passing day, the feeling that they were dealing with something beyond their reality was growing stronger. She felt like time was running out, and each new disappearance or inexplicable event only confirmed that the passengers weren't alone in their return. Something had come back with them. The incident with Ethan Carter marked a turning point in the investigation. The experts Emma had brought in were baffled by what they were hearing. The language Ethan had spoken during his trance was ancient, very ancient. The words came from mystical texts, long-forgotten cults from millennia ago. No one could understand how an ordinary man, with no connection to such knowledge, could be reciting such specific words. The linguist delivered a disturbing conclusion: the language seemed connected to rituals about crossing between dimensions. This discovery sent a chill through Emma. The concept of portals seemed like something out of a science fiction novel, but it was now a theory she couldn't dismiss. The passengers had all talked about presences, about something watching them. And now, Ethan was speaking words tied to the idea of moving between worlds. Emma needed answers, but the feeling that everything was slipping out of control grew stronger with each passing hour. In the hours following Ethan's episode, the other passengers grew restless. They knew something terrible was happening, even if they couldn't explain it. The interviews became more difficult. Many refused to speak, retreating into a disturbing silence. Others began to exhibit strange behaviors, murmuring in their sleep or staring for long periods as if trapped somewhere far away. Emma documented everything, her notes becoming more filled with uncertainty and theories that seemed to slip further from any scientific explanation. Then, amid the growing tension, Julie Harper came to Emma again. She was pale, with deep circles under her eyes, as though she hadn't slept in days. She sat in front of Emma, her hands trembling, her voice barely a whisper. I remember something, she said, breaking the silence that had surrounded her since the start of the investigation. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. Close. Whispering. Emma leaned forward, trying to catch every word. She needed to understand what Julie was revealing. He was talking to us, in the silence, but the words weren't human. Julie continued, her voice thin. It was like an echo, something we weren't supposed to hear. That confession left Emma disturbed. She knew Julie's account was another piece of the growing puzzle. The idea that something had communicated with the passengers while they were gone brought a new level of horror to the situation. Emma then shared the discovery of the ancient language with Julie, hoping to find a connection. Julie remained silent for a long time, then slowly shook her head. I don't know what it was, but I felt like, if I listened too much, I'd never come back. He wanted us to stay. All of us. The mystery of the language and the passengers' stories began to merge into an increasingly horrifying narrative. More and more, Emma felt that Samuel Brooks' disappearance and Ethan's collapse were just the beginning. This wasn't just about a missing flight and traumatized passengers. It was about something bigger. Something that the passengers were never meant to bring back. As the days passed, more passengers began to show signs of strange behavior. One of them, Greg Thompson, started obsessively drawing symbols in his room, scrawling them on the walls with whatever he could find. The guards reported that Greg would murmur while he drew, mentioning names no one recognized but that carried the same weight of emptiness and despair that echoed in the other passengers' reports. When Emma confronted Greg, he simply looked at her, his eyes filled with terror. "He's coming," Greg said, his voice low and raspy. "He wants us back." Those words echoed in Emma's mind for hours. What did Greg mean by "he's coming"? Was the invisible entity the passengers described about to manifest? And what did he mean by back? Could it be that this thing was still hunting them even now, after their return? Emma began to fear that the danger wasn't just about the past, but was fast approaching a new moment of crisis. Determined to better understand what was happening, Emma gathered her reports and began searching for patterns that could connect them to the interdimensional phenomenon the linguist had mentioned. The interviews with the passengers had revealed a lot, but key pieces were still missing. Now, with new evidence from Greg, Julie, and Ethan, Emma knew she was dealing with something that transcended human comprehension. The connection between the passengers, the unknown language, and the terrifying visions wasn't a coincidence. There was something bigger, something she hadn't yet fully uncovered. But before she could push further into her investigation, a new tragedy occurred. In the middle of the night, another passenger disappeared. This time, there were no signs, no open windows or trails left behind. He was simply gone, as if he had been taken somewhere beyond this world. Emma felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. Time was running out, and she needed quick answers before more lives were lost or something even worse happened. Whatever they had brought back with them was far more dangerous than she had imagined. The second passenger's disappearance was a breaking point for Emma. She felt that events were spiraling completely out of control, and every minute of uncertainty put more lives at risk. However, a new piece of the puzzle began to emerge. As she reviewed detailed information on each passenger, Emma made a disturbing discovery: they were all connected in a way that couldn't simply be coincidence. At first, it seemed vague until she dug deeper into their professions and activities before the flight. Many of the passengers had been involved either directly or indirectly in scientific and technological research projects. Some were engineers, others physicists, others mathematicians. Even those whose careers didn't directly involve science had attended conferences or events related to quantum physics or theories on alternate dimensions. It was as if all of them, in some way, had ties to experiments or projects that touched on the edges of science and reality. The connection between them seemed accidental, but Emma knew that in cases like this, coincidence was rarely the cause. The pattern was subtle, but it couldn't be ignored. Had they been chosen? Did someone or something know that these people would be on that flight? Or was the flight itself a tool used to gather these people? The questions kept mounting, each one more terrifying than the last. The connection between the passengers pointed to something bigger, as if they were part of a much more complex plan, one that involved the very nature of reality itself. Emma decided to delve deeper into the individual stories of each passenger. She started analyzing their lives before the flight, trying to understand what had made them targets or chosen for this bizarre experience. Every discovery raised more questions than answers. There were patterns of frequent travel to certain locations, involvement in mysterious research, or even contacts with obscure organizations dedicated to the study of paranormal or advanced scientific phenomena. None of it seemed to be coincidence. As she investigated, Emma began to realize she was no longer in control of the situation. The disappearances, the strange behaviors, and the supernatural signs were intensifying. She found herself looking over her shoulder more often than usual, feeling that something was watching her too. And, to her surprise, it wasn't just her. The guards and staff working with the passengers also began reporting an increasing sense of paranoia, as if everyone felt they were being watched by unseen eyes. The atmosphere in the facility had become suffocating, thick with fear that grew by the hour. One guard confided in Emma that during his night patrol, he had seen shadows moving down the corridors. When he went to investigate, he found nothing, but the feeling of being watched was so strong that he could barely maintain his composure. Others began reporting objects being moved or doors closing on their own. Small things, but when added together, they suggested that the presence the passengers described wasn't just a figment of their disturbed minds. It was something real, something now creeping into the physical world. Emma felt the pressure mounting. There was no more time for hesitation. She gathered her notes, the reports of the disappearances, and the unsettling accounts from the guards. She needed a new approach. She reached out to outside experts, scientists who worked in the field of unexplained phenomena who could bring a fresh perspective on the situation. Among them was Dr. Aaron Matthews, a physicist who had studied theories about parallel dimensions and alternate realities. Emma knew that contacting him could be crucial to understanding what was truly happening. When she spoke with Dr. Matthews, he confirmed her worst fears. According to him, there were theories that certain disappearance phenomena could be the result of a tear between dimensions. Although these theories had never been proven, he explained that under certain circumstances, it was possible for people, or even objects, to be temporarily moved into a parallel dimension. He mentioned something that made Emma's blood run cold, the idea that these tears weren't always accidental. They could be triggered, and some entities might use these breaches between dimensions to cross over. Emma began connecting the dots. The passengers' inexplicable experiences, their strange behavior, the disappearances, it all pointed to an external force trying to interact with their world. Perhaps the presence they felt wasn't just a residual trauma, but something real, an entity now trapped between worlds. And the most terrifying thought of all, this entity seemed to want to bring them back. Samuel Brooks, Ethan Carter, and the others who had disappeared weren't just victims. They were part of something bigger, something Emma still couldn't fully understand. In the back of her mind, the truth began to take shape. Flight 404 wasn't just an unexplained accident. It was the result of something intentional, something that involved forces none of the passengers, or even Emma, could comprehend. And now, those forces were getting closer to fully manifesting. Emma knew she couldn't waste any more time. Whatever they had brought back with them was gaining strength. And if she didn't act soon, it might be too late for all of them. Emma couldn't shake the sense of urgency that clung to her. Each new discovery brought her closer to a terrible but incomplete truth. Flight 404 wasn't just a mysterious tragedy or a case of traumatized passengers. It was something far bigger, and she needed to understand it quickly before more lives were lost, or something even worse happened. Her conversation with Dr. Aaron Matthews had confirmed her suspicions about the involvement of alternate dimensions. The idea of interdimensional rips was theoretical, but it was starting to seem terrifyingly real as Emma dove deeper into her investigation. Flight 404 hadn't just disappeared for 10 years, it had been pulled into one of these breaches. The idea was disturbing, an entire plane, with its passengers, floating between dimensions, trapped in a place outside of their reality. Emma spent sleepless nights poring over her notes, trying to piece together the puzzle. The interviews with the passengers, the mysterious disappearances, and the unsettling signs of something lurking in the darkness all pointed to one conclusion: something had escaped from that lost dimension. An entity, or perhaps more than one, was now in their world, using the passengers as a kind of connection to that reality. She knew she had to act. There was a pattern to the disappearances, a cycle repeating itself. If she couldn't break it, more passengers would vanish, or worse, the portal between dimensions could open fully, allowing this entity, or entities, to pass completely into their world. Emma struggled to remain rational, but the pressure of the situation, the growing urgency, and the constant sense of being watched were starting to erode her usual calm. The next morning, Emma received new information that changed the course of her investigation. Through a confidential contact at a government agency, she gained access to classified documents about experiments conducted at a military base decades earlier. That base had been involved in research on alternate realities, and to her horror, Emma discovered that some of the scientists behind those projects were among the passengers of Flight 404. Apparently, the flight wasn't a coincidence. There was a reason those people were on the same plane. The research project had involved creating technology capable of detecting and possibly opening portals to other dimensions. Flight 404 had been part of a larger experiment, perhaps even a deliberate attempt to cross the boundary between realities. But something had gone horribly wrong. Instead of merely observing the other side, the plane had been sucked into it, trapped for a decade. Emma felt the impact of this revelation. The flight hadn't just been an accident. It was the result of a clandestine experiment, and now, the price was being paid. Those scientists, those who had worked on these projects, knew the risks. But what they hadn't predicted was that something would come back with them. An entity that was now lurking, waiting for the right moment to fully break into their world. As Emma pieced together this new information, she began forming a strategy. She needed to find a way to close the portal, which, somehow, was still active even if unstable. The portal had not only brought the passengers back, it had allowed the entity to follow them. Emma realized that the disappearances were linked to the portal. Each time someone vanished, the portal grew stronger. It was as if it were feeding off the passengers' presence to gain strength. The tension at the facility reached a critical point. Guards and investigators were restless, and the passengers, increasingly haunted, could barely sleep. Some began reporting terrifying visions at night. Others, like Julie Harper, saw shadows moving in their rooms. Paranoia was spreading, and Emma knew time was running out. At any moment, another passenger could disappear, and the portal could open completely. That was when she decided to seek help from someone with experience in dealing with the unexplainable. She knew she needed more than science. She needed someone who had lived through this kind of event. One name came to mind: former military agent David Kane. Kane was known for having worked on paranormal investigations and handling situations that defied reality. Emma contacted him, explaining what was happening, and he agreed to meet her immediately. When Kane arrived at the facility, the atmosphere was already on the verge of collapse. He was a man of few words, but his presence inspired a sense of control that everyone desperately needed. Kane and Emma reviewed the information together. He had a practical understanding of what they were facing, and although he didn't have all the answers, he knew they needed to act quickly. Kane suggested a direct approach: locate the exact point where the portal was most active and try to close it before it became too unstable. They began mapping out the disappearances, trying to pinpoint a geographic pattern around the facility. To their surprise, all the recent vanishings occurred near a single central point, an abandoned military base in the northern mountains. That base, as Kane explained, had been one of the first sites where experiments with alternate dimensions had been conducted decades before Flight 404. Now it made sense. The portal was active there, and the passengers were being drawn to it by something they still didn't fully understand. Emma knew she had to go there. If that base was the center of the phenomenon, then that's where everything would be decided. She and Kane prepared to head out, fully aware that time was running out. The portal was more active than ever, and the entity was getting ready to make its final move. With every new step toward the truth, Emma felt the weight of her discoveries. What they had brought back with them wasn't just a shadow from the past. It was something connecting them to a world beyond what they could comprehend. Now, everything depended on closing the portal before the entity crossed into their world for good. The cold wind cut through the silence of the mountains as Emma and David Kane made their way toward the abandoned military base. The sense of urgency weighed on them like a heavy cloud, every step marked by the growing tension that time was running out. The base was only a few miles from the facility where the passengers were being held, but somehow, it felt like a different world, a place forgotten by time. The cracked concrete walls were covered in moss, and rust gnawed at the metal doors that barely moved. This was where the portal was active. This was where it would all end. As they reached the base's main entrance, Kane signaled for Emma to stay alert. His military instincts took over, and his experience with the unexplainable kept him focused. Emma felt something was different about the atmosphere. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy that made her hair stand on end. She knew they were close. The portal was somewhere inside that decaying structure. As they moved through the darkened hallways, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. There was something in the shadows, something following them closely, but always just out of reach, as if it were waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Kane stayed calm, but even he seemed unsettled by the environment. The walls bore strange marks, symbols Emma immediately recognized. They were the same symbols Greg Thompson, one of the passengers, had obsessively drawn before he disappeared. This wasn't a coincidence. They were standing at the heart of it all. Kane found the door to a control room that, despite the base's state of decay, seemed relatively intact. They forced their way inside, and what they saw made Emma's heart race. The room was filled with old equipment, control consoles that dated back decades, but looked as though they had been used recently. Maps lined the walls, diagrams that detailed studies on dimensional tears. Everything indicated that the base was still being used in secret by someone continuing these experiments. And worse, it seemed the passengers were key pieces in this experiment. Kane walked over to a large monitor in the center of the room. It was covered in dust, but clearly, it had been used not long ago. When he powered it up, a series of codes flickered across the screen, followed by an image that sent a wave of terror through Emma, a shadowy silhouette, a humanoid figure but distorted, standing in front of what appeared to be a breach in space. It was the portal. And on the other side, that entity was waiting. Emma knew in that instant that they were facing something far beyond their understanding. "We're close," Kane murmured, his eyes fixed on the screen. "But so is it. It can sense we're coming." Emma swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. The entity they feared wasn't just lurking. It was waiting. And now, it seemed to be feeding off the fear and uncertainty surrounding everyone who came into contact with the phenomenon. The portal was growing stronger. Each disappearance of a passenger seemed to increase the entity's power, as if it were gathering enough energy to fully cross into their world. They knew what had to be done. They needed to reach the exact location of the portal and close the breach before it became too powerful. Kane began preparing the equipment they had brought, analyzing the maps that pinpointed where the portal was most likely located within the base. The epicenter appeared to be in an underground chamber, a section only accessible by an old elevator that barely worked. Emma's heart raced as they headed to the deepest part of the base. Everything was building up to this moment. When the elevator finally arrived at the subterranean level, the air felt even thicker, as if they were breathing in something dense. The hallway ahead was long and dimly lit, with the lights flickering intermittently, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Emma could feel a strong presence, an oppressive sensation that something was waiting for them in the darkness. And, in fact, it didn't take long before the sound began. At first, it was a whisper, distant and almost inaudible. Then, the sound grew, becoming a low hum that seemed to fill the space around them. Kane raised his hand, signaling Emma to stop. He pointed toward a heavy door at the end of the hallway. That's where the sound was coming from, a sound that seemed to mix with voices, echoes of something that didn't belong to this world. They knew the portal was behind that door. Kane and Emma prepared themselves to enter. When they opened the door, what they saw made them freeze for a moment. In the center of the room, a vast crack floated in midair, as if the very fabric of space was being torn apart. The vision was distorted, like a shattered mirror, and at the heart of the crack, they could see the entity. An undefined figure, moving fluidly, like a liquid shadow, watching them from the other side. Emma knew then, it was now or never. If they didn't close the portal in that moment, the entity would fully cross over into their world. Kane immediately began assembling the device they had brought, a combination of technology and physics theory they hoped would seal the breach. But the entity, sensing what was about to happen, surged forward. The shadows in the room stretched, lengthening, and the hum in the air became deafening. Emma felt the pressure intensify in her mind, as if the entity was trying to invade her thoughts, to break her will. It was a battle not just of the physical, but of the mind. With nerves on edge, Emma helped Kane activate the device. A sharp sound cut through the air, and for a brief moment, everything around them seemed to stop. The portal began to slowly contract, as if being pulled back into the breach itself. But the entity fought against the closure, trying to hold on to its connection to this world. Emma felt a surge of desperation, but there was no turning back. They had to win. The sharp sound echoed through the room as the device worked to close the portal. The pressure around Emma and Kane was almost unbearable. The air seemed to vibrate, and the shadow at the center of the tear writhed like a creature trapped between two realities, fighting with everything it had to avoid being pushed back. Time was against them. The portal was starting to close, but the entity was reacting, using every last bit of energy from the missing passengers to maintain its hold on this world. Emma felt an invisible force pressing against her mind, a crushing weight that seemed to whisper directly into her thoughts. It was as though the entity was trying to take control, infiltrating her deepest fears, searching for the weakness that would break her resolve. She fought against the psychological assault, trying to focus on the urgent task of helping Kane activate the rest of the device. They needed to complete the process, or the entity would fully cross over, and everything would be lost. Kane remained focused, his fingers moving quickly as he adjusted the final components of the machine while the hum around them grew louder. Emma knew he was under as much pressure as she was, but his military experience and calm under fire were evident. He had faced unexplainable things before, but nothing like this. Nothing so vast, so powerful. The sense that they were fighting something beyond human comprehension was overwhelming, but they knew there was no choice. They had to close the portal, no matter the cost. The entity, realizing it was losing its chance, intensified its attack. The shadows in the room began to stretch, deforming into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for them. The hum became a distant scream, like multiple voices echoing from within the tear, calling out to them. Emma felt the fear rising inside her, the desperation tightening around her heart, but she refused to give in. She knew that if she succumbed to the terror, she'd be lost forever. Then it happened. In the middle of the growing tension, one of the lights flickered violently and went out. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and Emma saw the crack in the portal expand for a brief moment. The shadow inside the breach surged forward, like a giant hand reaching to grab them. Emma froze for a second, panic gripping her, but Kane pulled her back to reality. Now. We need to finish it now. Kane shouted, his voice full of urgency. Emma rushed to the device, her hands shaking as she adjusted the final controls. The machine began emitting a bright light, a pulsing glow that cut through the darkness of the room. The deafening hum grew louder, but now Emma could see the portal starting to retract again. The crack in the air began to shrink, inch by inch, and the shadow at the center of the breach writhed violently, struggling against the closure. The distant scream of voices became a roar of frustration, but the portal kept shrinking. Suddenly, Emma felt a wave of despair crash through her mind. It wasn't just fear. It was a deep sense of loss, a pain that seemed to root itself in her very soul. She realized the entity was making one final attempt. Instead of simply intimidating her, it began showing her images from her own past, painful memories, failures she had tried to forget. It was as if the entity was pulling at every emotional wound, trying to break her will at the most critical moment. Emma saw flashes of her life, the failure of a relationship, the loss of her mother, the emotional isolation she had always felt behind her professional facade. These memories hit her like blows, each one stronger than the last. She felt herself being dragged into an abyss of despair, but deep down, she knew she couldn't give in. Not now. The entity was using her own fear against her, but Emma was stronger than her worst nightmares. With tremendous effort, she broke free of the psychological pressure and refocused on the device. The portal was almost completely closed now, the crack in the air reduced to a thin, shimmering line. Kane was still adjusting the controls, but the sweat on his brow revealed how hard it was to maintain his concentration under the overwhelming pressure. The shadows around them twisted, slowly dissipating as the portal lost power, but the entity wasn't ready to give up. Emma looked one last time at the shadow within the portal. The entity moved frantically, trying to hold on to its connection to the real world, but the closure was inevitable. The device's light pulsed brighter, and in a final moment of tension, the portal snapped shut completely. The hum stopped, and silence fell over the room like a heavy curtain. Emma collapsed to the floor, exhausted. Kane stood for a moment, staring at the spot where the portal had been, his eyes hard and fixed. He knew the battle had been won, but the emotional and mental toll was clear on both of them. The entity had been pushed back into its dimension, but the scars from what they had experienced would stay with them. The silence in the room felt almost surreal. After everything, the portal was closed, and the entity was gone. Emma struggled to catch her breath, her mind still spinning with the images and sensations the entity had invoked. She knew that what they had faced wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. The trauma of the missing passengers, the secrets of the military experiments, and the entity's presence, all of it would haunt her for a long time. Kane finally broke the silence. "We did it, for now," he murmured, his voice tired. Emma knew he was right. The portal was closed, but the threat hadn't been completely eradicated. Something still lurked in the shadows, maybe waiting for another opportunity, another moment of weakness to manifest again. And as she tried to regain her composure, Emma knew that this battle wasn't over yet. They had won this time, but the war between dimensions was far from finished. The days following the final confrontation at the military base were shrouded in a strange mix of relief and unease. Emma tried to process everything that had happened. The portal was closed, the entity banished back to its dimension, and the remaining passengers were finally safe, or so it seemed. The chaos that had consumed the facility had subsided, but the silence that followed carried its own weight. Emma knew that what they had experienced in that place wasn't something they could simply move past. Back at the main facility, the passengers began to show signs of recovery. The strange behaviors, the constant nightmares, and the paranoia seemed to gradually fade. Yet, something in their eyes still suggested that the trauma they had endured hadn't been fully resolved. They had brought something back with them, an invisible shadow that, although it seemed to have vanished with the closing of the portal, still lingered in their minds. Julie Harper, one of the passengers Emma had followed closely, continued to struggle with sleep. Although she no longer spoke about the presence she had felt, the fear in her eyes betrayed the truth. She still carried that terror deep within her. Once, Julie had told Emma that even with the portal closed, she knew that he was still waiting. Emma tried to reassure her, telling her that it was all over, but deep down, she herself wondered if that was true. Emma returned home, exhausted both physically and emotionally. Her hands still trembled occasionally, and flashbacks of the confrontation with the entity invaded her thoughts at the most unexpected times. The battle hadn't just been physical, the psychological attack she had endured had shaken her deeply. The memories the entity had manipulated still echoed in her mind, making her question her own strength. She knew she had survived that moment, but the scars would remain. At home, Emma tried to get back to her normal routine, but the work surrounding Flight 404 never really left her. She found herself obsessively reviewing her reports, looking for any detail she might have missed. Even with the portal closed, she knew the interdimensional phenomenon hadn't been fully resolved. There were still too many unanswered questions. What exactly was that entity? How had it managed to access their world? And most importantly, what was stopping this from happening again? One night, while reviewing her final notes on the case, Emma heard a strange sound coming from the living room. It was a subtle noise, like the rustling of papers, followed by a faint creak. Her heart immediately sped up. She knew she was alone in the house, and that sound made no sense. Emma stood up slowly, feeling the cold creep down her spine. When she entered the living room, there was no one there, but something caught her eye. In the center of the coffee table, one of her old reports on Flight 404 was open. Emma didn't remember leaving the document there. She approached cautiously, her eyes locking on what seemed to be a new note, something she hadn't written. The words were hastily scribbled, but clearly legible. Her stomach twisted as she read the message. "He's still here." A wave of panic washed over Emma. She glanced around, searching for any sign that someone had been there, but the house was completely silent. It was possible that this was just a residual effect of the trauma, a stress-induced hallucination, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. The entity had left its mark on her, and somehow, it was still connected to her world. That night, Emma barely slept. The silence in her house felt heavier than usual, and the constant feeling of being watched had returned with full force. Even with the portal closed, she knew the entity was still out there, somewhere, not physically, but present in some dark corner of her mind. The portal may have been sealed, but the cracks it left behind were too deep to ever fully heal. In the days that followed, Emma began to notice other small signs. Objects moved out of place, shadows that seemed denser than they should have been, and a persistent sense that something was following her. She knew she wasn't going crazy. That entity had crossed the line between worlds, and though they had managed to stop it from fully manifesting, its consequences still loomed over her. Emma didn't know if this was just the echo of a deep trauma or if the entity had truly left a part of itself behind in their reality, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. She tried contacting David Kane, but he had disappeared since they left the base. None of her contacts could locate him, and the only answer she received was that he had gone off the radar. A cold shiver ran down Emma's spine as she realized that he, too, might have become a target. The fight against the entity was far from over, and with each passing day, the feeling that something was approaching grew stronger. The case of Flight 404 had officially been closed. To the outside world, everything was resolved, a disturbing mystery that would never have a satisfying public explanation. But for Emma, the truth was much darker. She knew it wasn't over. The portal had been sealed, but the marks it left were too deep to be erased. And then, one final night, as Emma was turning off the lights in her house, she saw something that confirmed her worst fears. In the darkness of the living room, a familiar shadow moved for just a brief second before disappearing like a distant echo. But she knew it wasn't just any shadow. It was a warning. The entity was still there, waiting,